The silk merchant's hands trembled as he unrolled the first bolt of fabric in 3 years, and in the settling dust motes that caught the morning light, he could still smell death. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The year was 1351, and the great marketplace of Tra stood half-empty beneath a sky that seemed wider than it had any right to be. Where once 10,000 souls had crowded between the timber-framed buildings, now perhaps 1,500 remained, moving through spaces that memory insisted should be filled with bodies, with voices, with the press of humanity that had defined these trading grounds for generations beyond counting. The absence was a presence of its own, a weight that settled on the shoulders like invisible hands, reminding everyone who walked those cobblestones that the world had changed, that something fundamental had broken, and that whatever came next would bear only the faintest resemblance to what had come before. Guillaume de Montfort had been 23 years old when the pestilence arrived, a journeyman cloth merchant learning his trade under his father's watchful eye, memorizing the subtle differences between Flemish wool and English broadcloth, between the blues that came from woad and those that came from the rarer, costlier indigo brought across impossible distances from lands he could scarcely imagine. He had been preparing to take over a business his family had operated for 4 generations, a careful inheritance of connections and knowledge, of established roots and trusted partners, of all the invisible architecture that made commerce possible in a world where a handshake might be worth more than a contract, and where reputation traveled faster than any horse. Now he was 26, and his father was 3 years dead, buried in a mass grave with 200 others on a Tuesday in October, when the grave diggers had finally given up trying to provide individual plots for the endless procession of corpses. His mother had followed 2 days later. His younger brother had survived the first wave only to succumb during the second outbreak the following spring, when everyone had desperately hoped that the worst had passed. Guillaume stood alone in a shop that had once seemed too small to contain the energy of his family's ambitions, and in the silence between the walls that had echoed with arguments about pricing and quality, and which fares were worth the journey, he felt the absence like a physical cold that no fire could warm. The silk he was unrolling now had come from Venice by way of Lyon, traveling routes that had been abandoned for years while the pestilence raged across Europe like a wind from hell itself. The Venetian merchant who had sold it to him had been a boy of perhaps 14, far too young to be conducting such business. But then age meant nothing any more when half the experienced traders were dead, and someone had to keep the goods moving, or civilization itself would collapse into the chaos that always lurked just beneath the surface of ordered society. The boy had named a price that would have been laughable before the mortality, 3 times what such silk should cost, but Guillaume had paid it without haggling, because he understood something fundamental about the world they now inhabited. Scarcity had become the governing principle of everything, and the old rules had died along with everyone who had enforced them. The silk whispered against the wooden counter, a sound like secrets being shared, and Guillaume found himself transported back to a time when such fabric had been commonplace enough that he'd barely noticed its beauty. Now, holding it in his hands, watching the way the light played across its surface with colors that shifted from deep crimson to purple, Depending on the angle of view, he felt something close to grief for all the ordinary miracles that had once filled the world before people understood how precious and fragile they were. This bolt represented months of labor, from the silk worms that had produced the thread, to the dyers who had coaxed these impossible colors from insects and plants and minerals, to the weavers who had turned raw material into something that seemed to capture light itself within its threads. And now it would be sold to one of the handful of wealthy survivors who could afford such luxury, worn perhaps to a wedding or a feast, displayed as a symbol of the wearer's status in a social hierarchy that was still struggling to redefine itself in the wake of catastrophe. Outside, the market was slowly coming to life, though the sounds were all wrong, the spaces between voices too wide, the absence of the roar that had once characterized market days at Trop, creating a kind of echo chamber where individual words carried further than they should. Guillaume could hear a spice merchant arguing with a customer about the price of pepper 3 stalls away, could distinguish every word of a conversation that would have been swallowed by the crowd in the old days. The new silence was punctuated by sounds that seemed too loud, too distinct. The clatter of a dropped pot, the whinny of a horse, the creak of a cartwheel that needed grease. Everything was isolated, individual, as if the world itself had been broken into separate pieces that no longer quite fit together. He had arrived in Troyes 5 days earlier, traveling from Paris with 2 apprentices and a guard, following roads that had once been crowded with merchants and pilgrims and all the traffic of a continent bound together by trade and faith. The journey had taken twice as long as it should have because entire villages stood empty along the route, because bridges had collapsed for want of maintenance, because the infrastructure that had seemed permanent and reliable had proven to be as fragile as the people who maintained it. They had passed through towns where grass grew in market squares, where doors hung open on empty houses, where the only sound was the wind moving through abandoned streets like the breath of ghosts. In one village they had found a single old woman living among the ruins, tending a garden behind a barricaded house, and she had stared at them with eyes that seemed to look through to some other world as they passed, offering neither greeting nor acknowledgment of their existence. The fair at Troyes had once been among the greatest in Christendom, one of the famous Champagne fairs that had made this region the commercial heart of Europe, the place where merchants from Italy and Flanders, from England and the German lands, from as far as Spain and the Baltic, met to exchange goods and information, to arrange marriages and negotiate treaties, to participate in the great dance of commerce that bound the continent together in webs of obligation and mutual benefit. Cloth from Flanders met silk from the east, spices from Venice encountered furs from the north, and in the exchange of these goods, in the extension of credit and the formation of partnerships, something greater than mere trade occurred. Culture itself was transmitted, ideas moved along with merchandise, and the fair became a kind of parliament of commerce, where the future was negotiated by people who understood that their prosperity depended on connections that transcended borders and languages and the petty conflicts of kings. Now, walking through the diminished marketplace, Guillaume tried to reconcile his memories with the reality before his eyes. Whole sections of the fairgrounds stood empty. Buildings that had housed merchant companies from distant cities now locked and silent, their owners dead or ruined, or simply unable to make the journey any more. The great cloth hall, which had once been packed so tightly with merchants and customers that moving through it required patience and determination, now echoed with space, with half the stalls shuttered, with lights streaming through windows that illuminated dust more than merchandise. The money changers' tables, which had once formed a solid line of financial infrastructure, where currencies from across Europe could be exchanged and letters of credit arranged, had been reduced to perhaps a third of their former number, and the men who sat behind them had the haunted look of survivors who still couldn't quite believe they had been spared. Guillaume had set up his stall in the section reserved for fine fabrics, claiming a space that had once belonged to a merchant from Bruges, whose entire family had perished, leaving no one to inherit either his place or his business. The appropriation felt like a kind of theft, but the market officials had simply shrugged when he asked about it, pointing out that empty stalls served no one and that the old man would have wanted his space used by someone who could continue the trade he had devoted his life to building. This was the new morality of survival. Take what you can use, waste nothing, and let the dead keep their silence, while the living struggle to maintain civilization with whatever tools remain. The first customers of the day began to appear as the sun climbed higher, and Guillaume was struck by how many of them were unfamiliar faces, people he didn't recognize from the old days, new money that had risen in the vacuum left by the old merchant families. There were men who had been servants 3 years ago, now dressed in the clothes of masters, conducting business with the awkward formality of people still learning the rules of a game they had only observed from a distance. There were women, too, more than there had been before, widows who had inherited businesses from dead husbands and discovered they had both the aptitude and the necessity to continue operations themselves, their presence in the marketplace a sign of how completely the old order had been disrupted. A woman approached his stall, perhaps 40 years old, dressed in good wool, but not silk, the kind of prosperous middle merchant or artisan who would once have been invisible among the greater traders, but who now represented the core of commercial activity. Her eyes went immediately to the Venetian silk, and Guillaume saw the calculation happening behind them, the weighing of desire against means, of what she wanted against what she could afford. She touched the fabric with fingers that knew cloth, feeling the weight and quality, and he could see the exact moment when she fell in love with it, when the practical merchant gave way to the human being who could still be moved by beauty even in a world half dead. "How much?" she asked, and her accent placed her as local, from Troyes or one of the nearby towns, someone who had survived while neighbors died, who had perhaps inherited property or business, or simply found herself needed in a way she never had been before. Guillaume named his price, watching her face for reaction. She didn't flinch, which told him she could afford it, but neither did she agree immediately, which meant she was a real merchant, someone who understood that negotiation was part of the ritual of purchase, that the price named was never the price paid. They began the careful dance of bargaining, each of them feeling out the other's position, each making small concessions that acknowledged the other's skill while protecting their own interests. It was familiar and comforting, this ancient choreography of commerce, a reminder that some human activities survived even catastrophe, that the fundamental patterns of exchange persisted even when everything else had been swept away. In the end, she paid perhaps 10% less than his first offer, and both of them left the transaction satisfied, which was the mark of good business. As he measured and cut the silk, wrapping it carefully in linen to protect it during transport, she spoke of her circumstances in the way merchants did, sharing information that might lead to future transactions while establishing the parameters of their relationship. She ran a dressmaking business now, having learned the trade from her mother, but only taken it over when her husband, a goldsmith, had died along with both their sons. The grief was still there in her voice when she mentioned them, but it was old grief, worn smooth by time and necessity, the kind that no longer prevented function but simply colored everything with a particular shade of loss. "There's demand for fine goods again," she said as Guillaume tied the package with string. "The survivors have money, and they want to live as if the world hasn't changed, as if they can buy their way back to normalcy. They pay premium prices for anything that speaks of luxury, of the old days when such things were merely expensive rather than rare." Guillaume nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He had seen it himself in Paris, the desperate gaiety of survivors who threw elaborate feasts and wore their finest clothes, as if beauty could ward off death, as if enough silk and gold and spices could rebuild the wall between civilization and chaos. There was something both admirable and pathetic in the effort, a refusal to surrender to despair that nonetheless carried the taint of denial, of people who wouldn't or couldn't acknowledge how completely their world had been transformed. "And the suppliers?" he asked, because this was the question that haunted every merchant now. "Can you find the materials you need?" She made a gesture that encompassed both affirmation and qualification, the universal merchant's acknowledgment that things were complicated. Some goods are available, others impossible to find. The supply chains that took generations to build broke in months, and rebuilding them is like trying to restore a shattered mirror. You can put the pieces back together, but the reflection is never quite the same, and there are always gaps where shards went missing. This was the new reality of trade, unpredictability, scarcity, and the constant need to improvise solutions to problems that had never existed before. Merchants who had once planned their purchases months in advance now bought whatever became available, adapting their offerings to match supply rather than demand. The great merchant houses that had coordinated complex operations across multiple countries had collapsed, leaving independent traders to navigate a fragmented market where information was scarce and rumor often substituted for reliable intelligence. After the dressmaker left, Guillaume spent time arranging his remaining goods, trying to create displays that would catch the eye of passing customers despite the reduced foot traffic. He had wool from England, though not the finest grades, serviceable cloth for everyday wear rather than the spectacular broadcloth that had once been the pride of London and York. He had linen from Normandy, adequate but not exceptional, the kind of middle-quality goods that had once been so common as to be unremarkable, but now represented a significant portion of available supply. And he had a small quantity of truly fine Flemish wool, deep black, and remarkably soft, the last remnant of a shipment that had arrived in Paris just before the pestilence struck, goods he had been hoarding for years waiting for the right moment and buyer. Around him, other merchants were engaged in similar activities, each trying to make the best of diminished inventories and uncertain markets. There was a spice trader from Genoa, a thin man with fever-bright eyes, who sold pepper and cinnamon at prices that would have caused riots in the old days, but which now seemed almost reasonable given the difficulty of obtaining such goods. There was a book dealer from Paris, a new face in the market, who specialized in medical texts and religious manuscripts, selling knowledge to survivors who sought either practical wisdom for preventing future outbreaks or spiritual comfort in the face of mass death. There was even a merchant who dealt exclusively in relics, selling fragments of saints' bones and splinters of the true cross to people desperate for any protection against another visitation of divine wrath. The presence of the relic seller bothered Guillaume more than he wanted to admit. There had always been such traders, of course, peddling questionable fragments to the credulous and the desperate, but their proliferation in the wake of the pestilence felt like a symptom of deeper sickness, a sign that society had turned away from reason and toward superstition in its search for explanations and protections. He had heard preachers claiming the mortality was God's judgment on human sin, that the only defense was penance and prayer and the intercession of saints. He had seen processions of flagellants traveling from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of contrition that seemed to assume God could be appeased by sufficient suffering. The rational part of his mind rejected these explanations, suspected that the pestilence was a natural phenomenon like drought or flood, terrible, but ultimately impersonal rather than a divine punishment for specific transgressions. But late at night, lying awake in the darkness, he sometimes wondered if the preachers were right, if humanity had somehow earned this catastrophe, if the weight of collective sin really could call down such devastation. By midday, the market had achieved a kind of rhythm, not the frantic energy of the old fairs, but a more measured pace that suited the reduced numbers and the general atmosphere of cautious rebuilding. Guillaume sold 2 lengths of English wool to a tailor from Reims, negotiated with a Flemish merchant about a potential partnership for importing better quality cloth, and declined to sell his precious black wool to a nobleman's steward, who offered a good price, but whom Guillaume instinctively distrusted. The negotiations and transactions filled the hours with familiar patterns, and there was comfort in the routine, even as he remained acutely aware of all the absences, all the merchants who should have been present, but whose stalls stood empty because they were dead or ruined or too afraid to leave the safety of home. During a lull in activity, Guillaume stepped away from his stall, leaving it in the care of one of his apprentices, and walked through the marketplace simply to observe, to gather the kind of information that couldn't be obtained through direct questioning, but only through careful attention to the subtle currents of commercial activity. He noted which stalls were busy and which stood empty, which goods drew interest, and which languished despite reasonable prices, which merchants seemed prosperous, and which were clearly struggling. This was the intelligence that separated successful traders from failures, the ability to read a market not just with the mind, but with some deeper instinct that synthesized 1,000 small observations into actionable understanding. What he saw was both encouraging and troubling. There was activity, yes, genuine commerce rather than mere survival trading, which suggested that society was indeed recovering, that the economy was beginning to function again rather than simply dying a slower death. But the nature of that activity had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The old merchant families, the great trading houses that had dominated commerce for generations, were mostly gone, their places taken by newcomers who lacked the experience and connections that had made the old system function smoothly. Credit, the lifeblood of medieval commerce, was harder to obtain because the networks of trust that had enabled merchants to extend goods on faith had been shattered along with everything else. Prices were wildly inconsistent, with identical goods selling for vastly different amounts, depending on the knowledge and desperation of buyer and seller. Most troubling was the absence of the great Italian banking houses, the Bardi and the Perutisi, and others who had provided the financial infrastructure that allowed commerce to transcend the limitations of physical currency. Some had failed spectacularly even before the pestilence, their loans to kings going unpaid as monarchs defaulted on obligations that would have ruined private citizens. Others had simply withdrawn from northern markets, retreating to their bases in Florence and Venice, waiting to see if the European economy would recover sufficiently to justify the risk of renewed engagement. Without them, without the ability to move money across distances through letters of credit and bills of exchange, trade became slower, more cumbersome, forced back toward a more primitive model of physical exchange that limited the scope and ambition of commercial activity. Guillaume found himself at the money changers' tables, watching the careful weighing of coins, the examination of edges to detect clipping, the testing of gold and silver content to ensure the currency matched its claimed value. Money was a problem in itself because so many rulers had debased their coinage during the crisis, mixing precious metals with baser substances to stretch their supplies, and now no one trusted any currency at face value. Every transaction required negotiation, not just about price, but about the very medium of exchange, adding layers of complexity to what should have been simple purchases. Looking at the numbers, at the careful columns of figures that represented his entire commercial existence, Guillaume tried to calculate his position. He had recovered some of what the family business had lost during the pestilence years, had rebuilt enough inventory to engage in serious trade, had re-established contacts that would allow him to obtain goods and find markets. But he was also working with diminished capital, operating in markets that remained fundamentally uncertain, competing with other merchants who were equally desperate to succeed in a world where the old advantages of family name and established reputation counted for less than they once had. The deepest challenge, he realized, wasn't financial, but existential. He had been trained to operate in a particular kind of world, had internalized assumptions about how commerce worked, about the reliability of certain patterns and relationships, about the future being essentially like the past, but with opportunities for incremental improvement. That world no longer existed. The pestilence had shattered it as completely as a hammer shatters glass, and while the pieces might be reassembled into something functional, it would never be the same, would always bear the marks of having been broken and repaired. What did it mean to be a merchant in this new world? The question haunted him as he lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar silence of a city that had once been vibrant with life. In the old days, being a merchant meant belonging to a particular social class, possessing specific knowledge and connections, participating in well-established patterns of exchange that were regulated by guilds and custom and law. Now those certainties had evaporated. New merchants were rising, who had never been trained in the traditional way, who ignored old restrictions and monopolies because the institutions that enforced them were weakened or dead, who approached commerce with a kind of desperation that made them willing to take risks that would have been unthinkable before. Guillaume wasn't sure whether he should embrace this new fluidity or resist it, whether the future belonged to those who could adapt quickly or to those who maintained continuity with tradition. He suspected the answer was some combination of both, but finding the right balance was proving difficult. Too much innovation, and you lost the accumulated wisdom that made certain practices standard for good reason. Too much conservatism, and you failed to recognize that the world had changed, that old solutions might not work for new problems. Sleep came slowly and when it finally arrived it brought dreams of crowded marketplaces and familiar faces, of his father demonstrating the properties of different fabrics, of his mother haggling with a customer, of his brother laughing at some joke Guillaume could no longer remember. He woke several times in the night, disoriented by the silence, expecting to hear the sounds of a bustling inn, but finding only emptiness, and each time it took a moment to remember where he was, what year it was, why everything felt so hollow and strange. Morning brought a return to the routines of commerce, and Guillaume rose early, breaking his fast with bread and weak beer, before making his way back to the market. The second day of the fair proceeded much like the first, with a steady trickle of customers, with negotiations and transactions, with the slow accumulation of small victories that, taken together, constituted progress. He sold more of his silk, moved some of his English wool, and even found a buyer for a portion of his precious Flemish black wool. A goldsmith who wanted to gift it to his daughter for her wedding, one of the first such celebrations in Troyes since the pestilence, and therefore an occasion that called for unusual magnificence. The goldsmith was an interesting case, a man who had lost his wife and 2 of his 3 children, but who had somehow retained his workshop and his skills, and had even prospered in a perverse way, because so many of his competitors had died, leaving him with a near monopoly on fine metalwork in the region. He spoke of his surviving daughter with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had lost too much, who invested all his remaining capacity for love in the one family member who remained, and Guillaume understood that the wedding represented more than just a union of 2 people. It was a statement of hope, a declaration that life would continue despite catastrophe, that the future still held the possibility of happiness and normalcy. "She's marrying a lawyer," the goldsmith explained as Guillaume measured and cut the black wool. "A young man who survived the pestilence and then had the good fortune to inherit his master's practice when the old man died without heirs. He's not from an important family, but in these times what does that matter? He's healthy, he's skilled at his profession, he's kind to my daughter. That's enough." Guillaume wrapped the fabric carefully, understanding that it would become a wedding dress, a garment that would be worn once and then preserved as a family treasure, a physical reminder of an important transition. "When is the wedding?" he asked. 3 weeks, the goldsmith said. "We're trying to make it a proper celebration, inviting everyone who remains in the city, marking the occasion with as much ceremony as we can manage. It feels important, somehow, to show that we're still capable of joy, that the pestilence didn't take everything." After the goldsmith departed, Guillaume found himself thinking about weddings and marriages, about the way such ceremonies had always marked the continuation of society, the formation of new families that would produce the next generation. During the pestilence years, weddings had nearly ceased, partly because people were too busy dying or fleeing or simply trying to survive to think about celebration, partly because the social mechanisms that normally arranged such unions had broken down. Now, as life slowly returned to something approaching normalcy, marriages were resuming, and they carried a significance beyond the usual joining of 2 individuals. Each wedding was a bet on the future, a statement that people believed life would continue, that having children made sense despite the recent demonstration of human vulnerability, that the institutions and traditions that had governed society before the pestilence retained their validity and importance. Guillaume, who had been too busy with survival and business to think much about his own matrimonial prospects, found himself wondering whether he should be seeking a wife, whether establishing a family was part of the responsibility of rebuilding civilization, whether his father would have wanted him to continue the family line that had nearly been extinguished by the mortality. The thought was uncomfortable, raising questions about purpose and meaning that went beyond the immediate concerns of commerce. Guillaume had devoted the last 3 years to keeping his business alive, to honoring his father's legacy by maintaining the family enterprise, but he hadn't thought much about what came after, about who would inherit when he himself was gone, about whether the de Montfort name would continue or end with him. The pestilence had made such questions simultaneously more urgent and more abstract, because everyone had lost so much that the idea of rebuilding families and dynasties seemed both desperately necessary and somehow presumptuous, an assumption that the future would cooperate with human plans when recent history had shown how completely chance and catastrophe could disrupt even the most careful preparations. By the 3rd day of the fair, patterns had become established, and Guillaume found himself settling into a rhythm that felt almost normal, as if the routines of commerce could create their own stability, even in the absence of the larger structures that had once supported them. He had made enough sales to justify the journey to Troyes, had established contacts that would enable future business, had gathered intelligence about markets and supplies that would inform his decisions for months to come. The fair was functioning, the market was operating, and if the scale was diminished and the participants different from what he remembered, the essential activity of exchange continued. On the 4th day, something unexpected happened. Guillaume was negotiating with a potential customer over a length of English wool when he became aware of a disturbance at the edge of the marketplace, a gathering of people around something or someone that had attracted unusual interest. The commotion grew, voices rising in excitement and alarm, and Guillaume excused himself from the negotiation to investigate, driven by the merchant's instinct that anything unusual might represent either opportunity or threat. At the center of the crowd was a group of travelers, dusty from the road and clearly exhausted. But what had attracted attention was not their condition but their identity. They were merchants from the East, from beyond the boundaries of Christendom, dressed in unfamiliar clothes and speaking languages that only a few of the onlookers could understand. With them were pack animals laden with goods, and even from a distance Guillaume could see silk and spices, exotic fabrics and strange implements, the kind of merchandise that hadn't been seen in these markets for years because the trade routes had been disrupted by pestilence and war and the collapse of the great merchant companies that had once coordinated such long-distance exchange. The leader of the group was a man of perhaps 50, with features that suggested origins far to the east, and he was speaking in broken Italian to one of the market officials, trying to explain their purpose and negotiate permission to trade. Guillaume worked his way closer, using his limited Italian to catch fragments of the conversation, understanding that these merchants had traveled from Samarkand or somewhere in that region, had followed the Silk Road westward with a cargo of goods they hoped to sell in the markets of Europe, had taken extraordinary risks to make this journey at a time when the old networks that would have supported and protected them were in disarray. The market official was clearly uncertain how to respond, caught between the desire to welcome trade and concern about admitting foreigners who might bring disease or political complications. The crowd around them was mixed in its reaction, some people excited by the prospect of exotic goods, others fearful of any contact with outsiders who might be carrying pestilence, still others simply curious about these strange visitors from lands most of them had only heard about in travelers' tales. Guillaume found himself pushing forward, using his status as a merchant to insert himself into the conversation, offering to serve as intermediary between the newcomers and the market authorities. His Italian was better than most, and he had enough understanding of commercial protocols to help navigate the complex process of admitting foreign merchants to the fair. The Eastern merchants regarded him with cautious interest, clearly assessing whether he could be trusted, whether he was trying to help or to take advantage of their vulnerable position. "You've come from Samarkand?" Guillaume asked in Italian, and the leader nodded confirmation. "By way of the Black Sea ports and Constantinople," the man explained, his Italian heavily accented but comprehensible. "We heard that trade was resuming in the West, that the great mortality had passed, that merchants were needed to bring goods that had become rare. We took the risk because the potential profit seemed worth the danger." Guillaume felt a surge of respect for these men who had traveled thousands of miles on the basis of rumor and hope, who had risked their lives and fortunes on the possibility that European markets would welcome their goods. This was what commerce required at its best: courage, vision, the willingness to act on incomplete information in pursuit of gain. These merchants embodied the spirit that had built the Silk Road and connected East and West, that had made possible the flow of goods and ideas across vast distances, that had enriched both ends of the exchange, even as it enriched the merchants who facilitated the connection. "What do you have to sell?" Guillaume asked, and the Eastern merchant gestured at the pack animals. "Silk from Persia, spices from further east, dyes and drugs and precious stones, manuscripts and metalwork, and things I don't have names for in your language. We brought what we thought would sell well, based on what Europeans wanted before the mortality, but we don't know if tastes have changed, if the market still exists for such goods." Guillaume immediately saw the opportunity and the problem. These merchants had valuable goods that would definitely find buyers, but they had no knowledge of local conditions, no connections to establish trust, no understanding of how much to charge or where to find the right customers. Without help, they would be vulnerable to exploitation by locals, who would take advantage of their ignorance, or they would set prices too high and fail to sell, or they would make some cultural or commercial mistake that would doom their entire enterprise. He made a quick decision, the kind of intuitive judgment that separated successful merchants from failures. "I'll help you," he said. "I'll introduce you to the market authorities, help you secure permission to trade, advise you on pricing, and make introductions to potential buyers. In exchange, I want a commission on your sales, 10% of whatever you sell through my assistance." The Eastern merchant considered this, his eyes sharp with the universal wariness of traders being offered deals by strangers. 5%, he countered, "and you guarantee to find us buyers for at least half our goods within the week." They negotiated for several minutes, finally settling on 7% commission, with Guillaume agreeing to make his best effort to move their inventory, though without guaranteeing specific quantities. It was a fair deal for both sides, giving Guillaume the opportunity to profit from goods he didn't have to purchase himself, while providing the Eastern merchants with the local knowledge and connections they desperately needed. Over the next few days, Guillaume devoted much of his energy to helping the Eastern merchants, introducing them to potential buyers, explaining European market conditions, advising on presentation and pricing. It was challenging work, requiring him to bridge not just language differences, but fundamental gaps in understanding about how commerce worked in different cultural contexts. The Eastern merchants were used to different negotiating styles, different concepts of time and obligation, different assumptions about trust and verification, and Guillaume found himself constantly translating not just words but entire frameworks of commercial interaction. But the effort paid off both financially and in less tangible ways. The exotic goods attracted enormous interest, and buyers were willing to pay premium prices for silk and spices they hadn't seen in years. Guillaume's commission mounted quickly, exceeding what he would have made from his own goods, and he found himself contemplating a future in which this kind of intermediary role, connecting Eastern suppliers with Western markets, might become a specialty that could support his business. More importantly, the presence of the Eastern merchants seemed to energize the entire affair, creating a sense of excitement and possibility that had been missing from the cautious, somewhat depressed atmosphere that had prevailed before their arrival. People began to believe that maybe the old patterns really could be restored, that the trade routes that had been severed by pestilence and war could be reestablished, that the European economy might recover not just to subsistence but to genuine prosperity. Guillaume spent an evening with the leader of the Eastern merchants, sharing wine and conversation, learning about conditions in Central Asia and the Middle East, discovering that the mortality had struck there too, that no part of the known world had been spared, but that recovery was proceeding unevenly, with some regions bouncing back quickly, while others remained devastated. The Eastern merchant, whose name was Mahmoud, spoke of the disruption of the Mongol trading networks that had once made the Silk Road relatively safe and efficient, described how the collapse of centralized authority had led to increased banditry and political fragmentation, explained how merchants now had to be their own protection, traveling in larger groups and taking greater precautions than had been necessary when the Pax Mongolica had guaranteed relatively stable conditions. "The old world is gone," Mahmoud said, echoing thoughts Guillaume had had many times. "We tell ourselves we're rebuilding it, but really we're creating something new, something that looks like what came before, but functions differently underneath. The roots are the same, the goods are similar, but the people and institutions and relationships are all different." Guillaume found himself nodding agreement, recognizing the truth of this observation. "Do you think the new world will be better or worse than what we lost?" Mahmoud considered the question seriously, swirling wine in his cup. "Different," he finally said. "Not better or worse, just different. Maybe more dangerous because the old protections are gone. Maybe more opportunity because the old monopolies and restrictions have weakened. Time will tell, and in the meantime we do what merchants always do. We adapt, we take calculated risks, we try to stay alive and profitable long enough to see how things turn out." This philosophy, pragmatic and unsentimental, resonated with Guillaume's own thinking. Merchants didn't have the luxury of waiting for certainty, couldn't afford to be paralyzed by doubt or fear. They had to act on incomplete information, make the best decisions they could with the knowledge available, and accept that sometimes they would be wrong, but that over time, over many decisions and transactions, skill and experience would produce more successes than failures. The fair continued through its traditional duration, and Guillaume worked harder than he had in years, juggling his own sales with his assistance to the Eastern merchants, making new contacts, gathering intelligence, slowly building the network of relationships that would sustain his business in the coming months and years. By the end, he was exhausted, but also exhilarated, feeling that he had accomplished something significant, that he had proven to himself that survival was possible, that the future might hold more than just grinding struggle to maintain what little remained. On the final day, as merchants began packing their goods and preparing to depart, Guillaume stood at the edge of the marketplace and tried to fix the scene in his memory. The fair had been diminished compared to its former glory, yes, but it had also functioned, had served its purpose of bringing together buyers and sellers, of facilitating exchange, of maintaining the connections that knit civilization together. He had come to Troyes uncertain about whether trade could recover, whether his business had a future, whether the effort of rebuilding was worth the energy it required. He was leaving with answers that, while not entirely reassuring, at least provided direction. Yes, trade would recover, though slowly and unevenly. Yes, his business could survive and even prosper, though it would require adaptation and risk-taking. Yes, the effort was worthwhile, because the alternative was surrender to despair and the collapse of everything human beings had built. The journey back to Paris was less lonely than the journey out had been, because Guillaume traveled in company with several other merchants, including Mahmoud and his group, who were planning to winter in Paris before continuing their circuit of European markets in the spring. They talked as they traveled, sharing stories and information, complaining about road conditions and inn prices, discussing plans and possibilities with the cautious optimism of people who had survived catastrophe and were determined to make something of their survival. They passed through the same empty villages Guillaume had noted on his outward journey, but somehow they seemed less desolate now, less like monuments to extinction, and more like temporary conditions that might eventually be reversed. In one abandoned town, they saw evidence that squatters had moved into some of the empty houses, that fields left fallow for years were being cleared and prepared for planting, that life was slowly seeping back into spaces that had been emptied by death. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but Guillaume seized on it as evidence that his tentative hopes might be justified, that human resilience might prove stronger than the forces of destruction. Arriving back in Paris, Guillaume found the city changed in subtle ways from when he had left it. There was more activity in the markets, more traffic on the streets, more signs of ordinary life resuming its patterns. The change wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of transformation that would be noted by historians, but for those who lived through it day by day, it was perceptible and significant. Winter was approaching, and people were preparing for it with the kind of methodical attention that suggested they expected to survive it, that they were planning beyond mere immediate survival toward actual futures that stretched into next year and the year after. Guillaume reopened his shop, unpacked his remaining goods, and began the work of recording his transactions, calculating his profit from the journey, planning his next moves. He had done well at Troyes, better than he had dared hope, and the money would allow him to expand his inventory, to take bigger risks, to begin thinking strategically about building his business rather than just keeping it alive. But more than the financial success, more than the goods sold and connections made, Guillaume felt that he had learned something important at Troyes, something about the nature of recovery and resilience, about how societies rebuild after catastrophe. It wasn't a simple process of restoration, wasn't a matter of just picking up where things had left off before the pestilence struck. It was messier than that, more complex, involved both continuity and change in proportions that were hard to predict or control. The new world would incorporate elements of the old while also being fundamentally transformed by what had been lost, by who had survived, by the adaptations forced by necessity. The Eastern merchants stayed in Paris through the winter, and Guillaume saw Mahmoud regularly, continuing conversations that ranged across topics far beyond mere commerce. They discussed philosophy and religion, compared their different cultural traditions, debated questions about fate and free will, and the meaning of suffering. Mahmoud was a Muslim, educated and thoughtful, and Guillaume found these conversations refreshing after years of engaging primarily with people whose worldviews were narrowly focused on immediate survival and commercial concerns. In Islam, Mahmoud explained one evening, as they sat in Guillaume's modest rooms above his shop, we have a concept called qadar, which means divine decree or destiny. It doesn't mean that human beings have no agency, but it does mean that ultimately outcomes are in God's hands, and our job is to strive and work while accepting that results are not entirely within our control. Guillaume considered this, finding it both similar to and different from Christian notions of providence. How do you reconcile that with being a merchant? He asked. Our whole profession is based on trying to control outcomes, on making careful calculations to ensure profit. Mahmoud smiled. You can't control everything. You can be wise, you can be careful, you can learn from experience, but in the end, markets shift, ships sink, caravans are raided, and sometimes, despite your best efforts, you lose everything. The question is whether you let that possibility paralyze you, or whether you act anyway, trusting that if you do your part well, things will generally work out. This philosophy appealed to Guillaume, seemed to capture something essential about how to live in a world that had proven itself capable of delivering catastrophe without warning or explanation. You couldn't eliminate risk, couldn't guarantee safety or success, couldn't protect yourself completely against loss, but you could act with integrity, could make the best decisions possible with available information, could work diligently and honestly, and hope that over time these qualities would be rewarded more often than punished. Winter passed, spring came, and with it the resumption of traveling and trading. Guillaume made several more journeys to various markets, gradually expanding his operations, slowly building back toward something approaching the scale his father had achieved. He specialized increasingly in fine fabrics, developed a reputation for having access to exotic goods through his connection with Mahmoud and other Eastern merchants, positioned himself as a bridge between European customers and Asian suppliers in an era when such connections were rare and valuable. He also, following the goldsmith's example and motivated by conversations with Mahmoud about the importance of family and continuity, began seriously considering marriage. He courted the daughter of another merchant, a young woman who had been educated beyond what was normal for women and who showed both interest in and aptitude for commercial affairs. They married in the summer, a modest ceremony that nonetheless felt significant to Guillaume as a commitment not just to another person but to the future itself, a statement that life would continue, that he intended to build something that would outlast him. The years that followed were difficult, but also strangely hopeful. The European economy continued its slow recovery, fitful and uneven, but generally moving in the right direction. New trade routes were established to replace those that had been disrupted. New merchant companies formed to fill the void left by those that had collapsed. New financial mechanisms developed to facilitate commerce in the absence of the great Italian banking houses. It was a time of improvisation and experimentation, of trying things that might fail but also might succeed, of learning through practice what worked in the changed conditions. Guillaume prospered, not spectacularly, but steadily, building a business that supported his growing family while also contributing to the larger project of commercial recovery. He traveled regularly to the major fairs, maintained relationships with suppliers and customers across Europe and beyond, participated in the complex dance of commerce that was simultaneously timeless and constantly evolving. He trained apprentices, passing on the knowledge his father had given him, while also adapting it to new realities, trying to preserve what was valuable from the past, while remaining flexible enough to embrace necessary changes. Looking back from a distance of 10 years, Guillaume could see patterns that hadn't been visible while living through them. The pestilence had indeed transformed European society, had broken the power of old institutions, and created opportunities for new people and new approaches. Population decline had shifted the balance of power between labor and capital, had given common people leverage they'd never had before, had forced changes in everything, from wage rates to inheritance laws to the organization of agriculture. The commercial world had become more fluid, less bound by tradition and guild restrictions, more open to innovation and risk-taking. But human nature hadn't changed. People still wanted the same things: security, prosperity, beauty, meaning, connection. The fundamental motivations that drove commerce remained constant, even as the specific mechanisms evolved. Merchants still sought profit, customers still wanted quality goods at fair prices, and the patient work of exchange continued to bind societies together across differences of language and culture and religion. Guillaume's own children grew up in a world that knew the pestilence only as history, as something their parents had lived through, but which they themselves only understood abstractly. He told them stories about the old days, about their grandfather and grandmother, about what had been lost, but he could see that these stories didn't have the same weight for them, that they thought of the mortality the way he thought of wars and disasters from before his own birth. Real but distant, tragic but not visceral. This was probably healthy, he thought, this ability of new generations to move on from trauma, to build their lives without being defined by catastrophes they didn't experience directly. The market at Troyes, when Guillaume visited it 10 years after his first post-pestilence fair, had recovered much of its former activity, though the participants were mostly different from those he remembered from before the mortality. New merchant families had risen, new trading companies established themselves, new patterns of exchange developed to replace those that had been disrupted. The physical spaces were the same, the buildings mostly identical, but the human landscape had been transformed as completely as if everyone had been replaced by strangers. Standing in that marketplace, watching the crowds and the commerce, Guillaume felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for what had been lost, satisfaction at what had been rebuilt, wonder at human resilience, uncertainty about what the future held. The pestilence had been a catastrophe that killed millions, that disrupted civilization, that broke patterns that had seemed eternal, but it hadn't ended everything. People had survived, had adapted, had rebuilt, and life continued in forms both familiar and strange. He thought about his father, wondered what the old man would make of the world that had emerged from the ruins of the one he'd known. Would he recognize his profession in what Guillaume now did? Would he approve of the changes and adaptations that had been necessary? Guillaume liked to think he would, liked to believe that his father's essential pragmatism would have embraced whatever worked, Whatever allowed commerce to continue, whatever served the fundamental purpose of connecting people through exchange. The silk merchant's hands no longer trembled when he handled fine fabrics, though he never forgot that morning when they did, when the weight of loss was so heavy that even beauty hurt to touch. He had learned to carry his grief without being crushed by it, had found ways to honor the dead while serving the living, had discovered that rebuilding was possible even when restoration was not. The market had opened again after the great mortality, and in that opening and that resumption of exchange and interaction and all the messy complexity of human commerce, civilization had found its path forward, not back to what had been, but toward something new that incorporated both memory and hope. Guillaume de Montfort was a merchant, and he would die a merchant many years later, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried on his work, who maintained the family business he had preserved through catastrophe and rebuilt through determination. His life was not particularly remarkable in the grand sweep of history, did not include great adventures or world-changing achievements, consisted mainly of the patient accumulation of small victories and the careful navigation of ordinary challenges. But in its unremarkable persistence, in its quiet refusal to surrender to despair, in its dogged commitment to the work of rebuilding, his life represented something essential about how societies survive catastrophe, not through heroic gestures or dramatic transformations, but through the mundane courage of people who simply refuse to give up, who continue doing what they know how to do even when the world has been shattered around them, who trust that if enough people maintain enough ordinary functions, civilization will survive and eventually flourish again. The market remained open, then and for centuries after, a testimony to human resilience and the enduring power of exchange to connect people across differences and distance. And in the quiet continuation of trade, in the patient work of merchants like Guillaume buying and selling, negotiating and transporting, creating and maintaining the connections that bound the world together, the future was built one transaction at a time, one relationship at a time, one small victory at a time, until the catastrophe receded into history and life resumed its eternal patterns of change and continuity, loss and recovery, death and renewal.